For all the Jural Assemblies 59 Lessons in Sovereignty. May 22, 2019 by Anna von Reitz. First of all, sovereignty is inherited. It is not something that simply devolves upon us by virtue of winning a war. You have all inherited sovereignty in your own right and the right to own property, as opposed to being considered property, by being born on the land and soil of your state of the Union. Second of all, the delegation of powers under the constitutions would not be possible if the Americans had not established sovereignty. A king can delegate powers to a queen, or to another king, to exercise in his behalf, but no one of lesser standing can do this. The simple fact that the British Monarch has been in receipt of delegated powers of ours since 1787 is all the evidence needed to prove that we possessed sovereignty prior to the establishment of the constitutions. Third, our actual claim to sovereignty is based upon the Norman conquest and a particular kind of sovereignty called sovereignty in one's own right that William the Conqueror bequeathed to his loyal barons in England. In essence, he made land grants to each one following the conquest, and upon his death in 1087 AD, he made all of them sovereigns in their own right in England. They were still barons in France, and owed William's heir fealty in France, but in England, they were kings with permanent hereditary holdings of land. In England, King John was just one among many kings, and the only distinction of his office was that he was responsible for the maintenance and preservation of the church's properties and the Commonwealth land. The Commonwealth was co-administered by the Church and amounted to waste land and property that the king entrusted to the Church to develop and manage for the benefit and support of the paupers, the sick, and others not able to support themselves. The Church took over these Commonwealth properties and used them for good purposes in the communities they served. They used these properties to create common grazing fields, to establish orchards, apiaries, and herb and medicinal gardens, community vegetable gardens, and cemeteries. Rarely, the Church inherited good wooded ground, woodlots, and more rarely still, they were able to convert swamps into arable land via installing drainage ditches, dikes, and dams. The profits were used to support the Church's charity efforts. So, it was King John's position as the king involved in these activities that gave him any special position in England at the time of the Magna Carta. If John had been king of the country in truth and fact, then he could not be held to the Magna Carta longer than the ink was dry, and he denied his free-willing consent to it. The fact that the Magna Carta has stood on the land and soil jurisdiction until this day is again testimony to the fact that the French Norman barons and their progeny, acting at the time of the Magna Carta, basically 128 years after the settlement of the Norman conquest, were certainly in possession of sovereignty in their own right, and as equal kings on the land and soil of England were able to impose their demands lawfully upon King John despite whatever he wanted and despite what the Pope wanted, either. The Bell shares, the family of William the Conqueror, his cousins and other relatives who remained in England, intermarried and settled in, all as sovereigns in their own right. Their names became anglicized to Belcher, and they formed a special alliance with the Clintwoods, a noble English family, an alliance that endured for many generations and followed them to America. In early America, one branch of the Belchers acted as the royal governors of areas that would one day become 3 states of the Union, but this branch, headed by Governor Jonathan Belcher, founder of Princeton University, died out. The Belchers who remained in America retained both their ties to England and their ties to the Clintwood family. William Belcher, the name William, is retained for many, many generations and derives from William the Conqueror and Guilleroi de Lancelot du Lac, the son of King Ban of Gaul, our common ancestor, was here and sided with the colonists against George III, and as he possessed sovereignty in his own right, inherited from his Norman French ancestors, he was fully competent to stand toe-to-toe with George III, just as the Norman barons were competent to stand down King John. Sovereignty operates in the national and international jurisdictions. When sovereignty is changed upon the soil, that is, the national jurisdiction, we see total regime change. The names of countries change. Their systems of government change. Most of the time, challenges to sovereignty occur in the international jurisdiction of the land and sea, with pushing and shoving over trade policies and offshore fishing rights and those sorts of things. In both cases, whether national or international, domestic or non-domestic, sovereignty is exercised according to the demands of the jurisdiction. On the soil, the sovereign acts as the personification of the people. In the international jurisdiction of the land, the sovereign acts as the lawful person personifying the people of a country. In the international jurisdiction of the sea, the sovereign acts as the legal person personifying the legal personages of a nation. But what happens when sovereignty in one's own right is bequeathed to many people, instead of just one? As William the Conqueror did, and as William Belcher did? Then every man and woman in inheritance of such sovereignty becomes equal to the king or queen of any other country, and the entire system of monarchy is overwhelmed. From the standpoint of the British monarchs and the popes, this is the most damaging part of both the Norman Conquest and the American War of Independence, because it serves to destroy the elitist system of feudalism, including corporate feudalism, upon which they depend. According to their reasoning, for one man to be king, all others must be in subjection. According to the Williams, men whose names mean resolute protector, this is hogwash. According to them, all mankind can earn their sovereignty, and as far as Americans are concerned, we need only seize upon our birthright and refuse the nanny state options offered by the Queen and the popes. As a result of our unique history and our unique constitutional system, it has been very hard for them to weasel in and make false claims to the effect that we have knowingly and voluntarily gifted our good names and estates to them in exchange for being taken care and bossed around and exploited as property by the kings and/or the popes. It has taken decades and not a little prevarication and clandestine undisclosed contracting processes, plus falsification of records, for them to establish the current system of corporate feudalism on our shores, but all it really takes is for Americans to wake up and remember their inheritance, claim back their birthright political status, and take up the job of being sovereigns in their own right again. On the soil jurisdiction, all such sovereigns are one of the people of the soil; on the land jurisdiction they are one of the people known to be lawful persons, and on the international jurisdiction of the sea, they are legal persons. When you return your legal person to the land and soil jurisdiction, it becomes a lawful person, owed all the guarantees and protections of the constitutions. You come back into your birthright inherited status as a sovereign in your own right. When you return all the derivative names, including the STRAWMEN, to the land and soil and declare their permanent domicile on the land and soil of an American state, they are lawfully converted, and they, too, are owed all the guarantees of the constitutions. Because sovereignty is inherited from other sovereigns, you cannot avoid being a sovereign in your own right from the moment of your birth, but you can, if it is done consciously and voluntarily, which in our case, it never is, pledge allegiance to other sovereigns or symbols, and become subjected to them as a result. Generations of American school children have been taught to pledge their allegiance to an inanimate symbol, the federal war flag, without realizing that they are presumed to be subjecting themselves to the Queen, who is flying our own flag under our delegated powers. Various means of entrapment and identity theft have been used to capture and seize upon American sovereigns and to unlawfully convert them into U.S. citizens who are subjects of the Queen and into citizens of the United States who are subjects of the popes, but all this activity has been without disclosure, rendering all such pretended citizenship obligations moot and unenforceable so long as you are prepared to stand up and exercise the sovereignty that is your inheritance and birthright, the sovereignty in your own right, of all free men and women. Many questions have been raised about James Clinton Belcher and his role in all this. During the Theodore Roosevelt administration, the Scottish interloper doing business as the United States of America, Inc., founded in 1868, was preparing to go bankrupt. James's great-uncle, Clintwood Belcher, rode to Washington, D.C., to take possession of the Great Seals, the Great Seal of the United States of America and the Great Seal of the United States. On his way home, as he crossed over into Maryland, he was viciously attacked by men waiting to ambush him. In the resulting fight, he killed 6 of his attackers. His own horse was killed also. He grabbed one of the dead men's horses and rode off into the night, making for the western frontier to save his life. They stole the Great Seals, and they lied about the whole circumstance and branded Clintwood Belcher as a horse thief, neatly omitting their own grand theft under deadly force, their intent to murder, their killing of his horse, and all the rest of it. He spent the rest of his life on the lam, always looking over his shoulder, always moving from place to place to place. Theodore Roosevelt considered him a danger to our government, self-evidently meaning the foreign territorial usurpers on our shores. Clintwood died without issue, so the torch passed to his younger brother, James, and from James to his son Orville, and from Orville to his son, James Clinton Belcher. At the time my husband was born in 1941, federal agents were still hunting and harassing members of the family. Orville Belcher moved his young son 12 times in the first 10 years of his life, constantly moving just as great-uncle Clintwood had to move and keep moving to avoid being arrested on false charges or be murdered outright. This is not a glamorous story. It's a painful, scary, shameful story, in which good men were replaced by bad men, honorable men replaced by crooks, and innocent people who were the victims of crime were portrayed as criminals, while the actual criminals sat at ease on the White House lawn. The Belchers have lived poor and they have lived rough, but through it all, they remembered who they are. They remembered their hereditary offices. They remembered their lineage. They never ceased the search to recover the Great Seals. The Great Seals surfaced briefly in New York City in the possession of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. They have now surfaced again in Indonesia. From our perspective, the Belchers are still the owners of the seals no matter how many generations of pirates may possess them. Under mandate and maxim of law, possession by pirates does not change ownership. Nor, obviously, do any documents that have been impressed with those seals since their theft during the first Roosevelt administration have any validity or power to bind us, as they have been exercised without our knowledge or consent. The custodians of the Great Seals in Indonesia are under demand to return them to us as stolen property. If these heirlooms are not returned, we shall have them recast in their original form. It should be noted that the office of Hereditary Head of State is not a public office. It is a private trust office, a lawful person, and while it is an office which James Clinton Belcher claims by direct descent, the reason for doing so is to prove to the Queen that yes, we still exist. It is not only those who received sovereignty at the hands of our ancestor, it is also those who received life from his body and soul who are still here on these shores. There is no plausible excuse for the Queen or the Pope to continue their pillaging on our shores. Now, you are being called upon to remember who you are, too. Americans. Sovereigns in your own right. Not United States citizens, who are subjects of the British Queen. Not citizens of the United States, who are subjects of the Roman Pontiff.